welcome to Deep Dive, everybody. This is actually our very first live show that we're doing, and we're really excited to do this. It's going to be the first of quite a few, as we hope more and more people take advantage of the opportunity to find out a deeper view of what's going on in the world, and maybe more than they're going to get in some 3-minute, news bite on the main popular media. And today is going to be one we're going to do that I think that the either in print or in the major media they just don't get very much of, and that is in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war. What about the Ukrainian people? Very often they're just almost a caricature or almost not even mentioned, and it's just like Zelensky and Putin and Biden and Stoltenberg and the big heads of the two places, and almost the people of Ukraine are an afterthought because there's just not much on what they're about. Well, on today's episode, we've got a real treat for us. We've got actually a colleague of mine from Defense Priorities, Rajon Menon. And Rajon, welcome to the show. We're really happy to have you here.
Thank you, Danny. I know this is a new venture, so I'm especially glad to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. And just so for all of those who don't know Rajon here, he is currently the director of Grand Strategy Program at our Defense Priorities and the Ann and Bernard Spitzer Chair Emeritus International Relations at the Powell School, City College of New York. He's also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, Columbia University, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His books include Soviet Power with the Third World, The End of Alliances, and most recently, I think, The Conflict in Ukraine, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order, which, as I recall, or as I understand, was actually published before the war. So that even goes back. You can talk about that in just a second. In addition to numerous publications in academic journal, Menon has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, LA Times, and, well, everything major. So, again, welcome to the show, Raj. Really glad to have you here.
Thank you, Danny.
So let's just jump right in here, because one of the things I want to do is to really set the stage so people can understand why you know some of these things here, and maybe quite a bit among a lot of Western writers or people who are reporting on this war or analysts. You've been to Ukraine quite a bit. And I wonder if you could just start off telling us, when was the first time that you went to Ukraine, and then just kind of maybe talk about the period from 2014 up to the start of this war and what your interaction was in Ukraine.
So I never went to Ukraine when it was a republic within the USSR, the Soviet Union, but I started going there actually relatively recently. That is after the war of 2014, when, as you know, Russian forces, mainly irregulars, set up two breakaway provinces in the east, and then Russia intervened in Crimea, staged a referendum, and annexed it. But since the war began on February 24th of last year, I've been there so far 3 times. My first trip was in August of last year. Then I was there in November, December. You may remember that this was the time when the Russians were attacking the electricity grid and trying to put the lights out. And then I was there in June. I hope to go back sometime this October. So I've been there a fair amount. I've tried to spend as little time in Kiev as possible and try to get out as close to the front as I can, bearing in mind the considerable risks.
So I wonder if you can tell me, from the people of Ukraine that you have met, at least as much as you can, tell me a little bit about what the attitude was and the intention was, and I guess the state of mind when the war first broke out in February of 2022 up through, say, that summer. So what was the first batch like? Because my understanding is that it was quite strong. There was apparently genuinely large numbers of men going in to volunteer to fight and all that. And certainly is famous now is that Ukraine was much sterner fighters than anyone gave them credit for at the beginning. And so how did that translate into the population as well?
So initially, my sense is that they were stunned. As you may remember, when Biden kept warning Zelensky about the buildup of Russian troops that had occurred over a series of months before the February war of last year, but Zelensky didn't really want to hear about it. Whether he was in denial or he believed that the markets would be rattled, it's not clear. But I think that until fairly late, they did not think, actually, I did not think that there would be an invasion. So the initial reaction was shock and disbelief because they were in a situation that they'd never been in. This was not like 2014. This was a full-on attack on the country.
So,
I
so
don't,
and actually, I guess kind of to bolster that, I believe it was in April of 2021. There was a pretty sizable Russian buildup along the border, and it lasted for several months. And people at that time were wondering if there was going to be an invasion. And everybody says, "Oh, it's just him posturing or whatever." And then when
correct.
it started again later in 21, people said, "Yeah, posturing part two." That's on the outside, but I guess you're saying that was similar on the inside as well.
As best as I can say, that is true. Now the question is whether it was simply the human inclination to not reckon with the reality or the belief that Putin wouldn't do something like this. And, I can tell you a little bit about why I myself was surprised by this because there's a narrative about Putin now that I don't think is quite accurate. And it explains, in some respects, why this was such a stunning development.
Yeah. So continue on with that. Why do you think
Okay,
that?
so the Putin that is painted now is of a riverboat gambler, somebody who sees Ukraine as the first stop on the way to the conquest of the Baltics and perhaps even Poland, an inveterate imperialist, and so on. Now, you know the narrative quite well, and I
Yeah.
suspect your audience does as well. My reading of Putin is very different. Let's go back to 2001, 9/11. He was the first foreign leader to call President Bush and said, "What can I do to help?" He helped open up the northern supply routes to Afghanistan. He was a member of the G7 and actually quite relished his encounters with Western leaders and saw Russia, in a sense, as part of the West. As far as military steps go, there were some, Georgia 2008, but it was limited to protecting a breakaway enclave in Georgia called South Ossetia, which actually the Russians had helped create way before Putin came. It was in the early 90s. Then came Crimea 2014, Crimea and the Donbass. Now, those were not high risk operations because, in the case of the Donbass, the Russian army intervened actually only once the local forces got into trouble in a battle called the Battle of Debaltseve. As for Crimea, it was a Russian majority province. There had been
Yeah.
significant sentiment even before the annexation that they should join Russia. It was transferred, by the way, um, to the Ukrainian Republic of the USSR only in 1954, but the Russians had a naval base there through a lease agreement with
Yeah.
Ukraine, and there were many, many Russian ex-military people there. So, in a sense, it was a safe move.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong,
2020,
but there were some similarities between the two provinces, North Ossetia and I forget the Abkhazia, I think it was in
yes,
Georgia in 2008, and the help in Luhansk and Donetsk and those two breakaway portions in 2014. So it seemed at that time anyway that it was going to be limited like the previous one was, and then Russia never went on to even attempt to conquest anything else in Georgia, and at least in 2014 they didn't try to go anywhere beyond the Luhansk, Donetsk, and the Crimea. Do you
correct.
think that Putin was trying to send a similar message there of like, look, just stay out of NATO or keep Ukraine out of NATO, and this is all I'm going to do? Or what do you think might have been his intention at that time?
Yeah. Before I answer that, just a footnote. We shouldn't also forget the intervention in Syria, but he sent no ground troops into Syria. It was all an air campaign. My point is that there's nothing before this war began to suggest that Putin was some wild-eyed individual who was prepared to throw caution to the wind. So this was
I
one
see.
reason why many people were taken taken aback. So yes, there is some parallel between your point about the republics, the breakaway areas in Georgia, and what happened in the Donbass. But the point to bear in mind, right, is that
Yeah.
there has been an evolution in Putin. He's now presented as this inveterate imperialist that has walked through time unchanged. Now, do I have a good explanation for why he chose to attack? I can
Which was
venture,
my next
yeah,
question. Yeah.
yeah, which I can venture some guesses. Now, there's a big debate, as you know, Danny. in the crowd that we hang around with about what was the role of NATO expansion. So to put my cards on the table, I thought NATO expansion was a bad idea well before it actually began to be implemented, when it was mentioned as a simple idea. Why? Because I thought the march of a Cold War alliance toward Russia's borders at a time when in the 1990s it was on its knees, and
Yeah.
we were telling it that it was a fledgling democracy and no longer an adversary and a partner of the West. Moving that alliance eastward would have been seen as either inexplicable or as a threat. Now, it's important to remember that the Russians saw this well before Putin ever came on the scene as prime minister in 1999 and
Mhm.
president as 2000. Yeltsin made it clear. And even the most pro Western of Russian foreign ministers, Andrei Kozyrev, when this began, said,
Right.
this is going to create a backlash in my country. Now, where I part company with people like my good friend John Mearsheimer and perhaps you and others, and that's fine, we should be having a debate about this, is whether NATO expansion was the trigger for the war. I don't think so, and I'll tell you why, notwithstanding my criticism of NATO expansion. I fully accept that the Russians saw it as an
A
unfriendly
factor. Yeah.
move. When the war began, you remember that in Bucharest 2008 at the NATO summit, the United States had pushed a reluctant NATO to open the door for Ukraine's membership. So between 2008 and February 2022, had there been any change that suggested that Ukraine was about to get into NATO? No, they'd kept it waiting for 14 years without even giving it so much as the initial stage, which is a membership action plan. So it was not as if when Putin began the invasion, Ukraine was about to get into NATO. Now, it is true that the military cooperation between the West and Ukraine, training and arms supplies and so on, ratcheted up significantly during the period from 2014
Yeah.
till the invasion. No question about that. But the NATO membership thing, I don't think was imminent. In fact, it's been made much more likely now. And as you know, Finland, which had no desire to join
Right.
NATO, has joined, and now Putin has a bigger border with NATO than he ever had before.
So the question, Raj, is let's back up into the I guess the autumn, let's say October of 2021, because that's when the final buildup prior to invasion actually began, and you saw a lot of increase in rhetoric from the Russian side, whether it was from the prime, I'm sorry, from the foreign minister, or from President Putin himself. They seem to really be saying, no, we don't want Ukraine in NATO, and that spawned, now that basically the NATO side, Stoltenberg in particular, and certainly many other state heads in NATO, were kind of like, okay, well, you're not going to tell us what we're going to do. Nobody decides who's coming into NATO but NATO, and it's our own thing. And then I believe, I can't remember if it was December or January, but Stoltenberg just emphatically went on television one day and said, no, Ukraine and Georgia will be in NATO. I don't care what Putin's saying. And Stoltenberg actually discussed this in September, where Putin apparently behind the scenes told him that we're going to invade if you don't withdraw the NATO membership. And he said and certainly we're not going to sign that agreement. And of course, at that point, he's not going to be able to. I mean, it's just nearly impossible for anyone to succumb to the verbal threats, et cetera. But, in light of what actually happened, maybe we could go back and do some things differently. But the
Right.
question I have, though, and I'd like you to touch on as best you can, is what changed in 2021 that made Putin then decide he needed to go even more and to potentially and then later risk war?
Right. So I think I told you before coming on the air that if I didn't know the answer to something, I would say so. So this is one of these questions for which I don't have a good evidentiary answer. So let me venture some thoughts, tentative thoughts. I think that something changed in Vladimir Putin's thinking during his COVID isolation.
Hmm,
Very, very few people
interesting.
had access to him. I'm sure we've all seen the pictures of the long table. He sits at one end, any guest sits at the other end. And the only person who had regular access to him, as far as we know, is a person named Vladimir Medinsky, who is a figure probably not well known to Western listeners, but he is an arch nationalist. We also know that Putin did an enormous amount of reading about Russian history, fixating in particular on Catherine the Great, Peter the Great. Putin is not that old, almost 70, just over 70, but he probably was thinking maybe about his legacy. He also had important parts of the National Archive brought to him, and there was a kind of a stewing in the juice of Russian imperial history. This doesn't mean, and I don't want to suggest this, that he wasn't concerned with NATO expansion, but there was a different Putin that emerged during that period. Now, do I
Fascinating.
have evidence to back what I'm saying? No. All I can tell you is I saw a change in Putin's thinking. He essentially had decided that it was no longer fruitful to engage with the West and that he had to lay down some markers. When the buildup occurred at some point well after it was underway, you, of course, remember this. There were two draft treaties that he presented
Yeah.
to the West. And the upshot of that was essentially to prevent not only Ukraine getting into NATO, but to remove
Yeah. Roll
any
NATO back
presence
to the
of
1997
Russia.
borders, I believe.
Correct. Exactly. Exactly. So, as best as I can make out, that's what happened. And I say this because, look, like you, I've been looking at this part of the world for a very long time. Did I expect a full on invasion? Absolutely not.
Right. Yeah. And you, I mean, you're right. Only historians, probably decades from now, are going to be able to tell us what was really going on in Putin's mind, and it's just something that we're going to have to leave for the future history books that have yet to be written on that. But it's certainly a question that is very important, and to as to why he suddenly changed, and then of course the dynamics which continue to ratchet up and build and has resulted in what it was here. Let's go back now a little bit, or actually change track a bit, and talk about, and again, to the extent that you can address like the Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian people, if that's even possible here, on two specific issues, and that's in it has been reported in recent months among both some former NATO or European leaders, and as well as a lot of other analysis, to suggest that the Minsk Accords, which were instrumental in attempting to get rid of the first clash between the western and eastern part of Ukraine, with Russia's participation in there, to try to bring that conflict to an end. And I believe it was 2015. There's two rounds of Minsk Accords. But the bottom line is it was supposed to result in both sides disarming and then coming together. And it was a bunch of things that were supposed to happen. Both sides claimed that they were following the Minsk agreements, but the other side didn't. But then here a couple of months ago, you had, I believe, Angela Merkel and some others that said, actually, we never intended the Minsk agreements to be implemented. It was just to buy time for Ukraine to arm up to defend themselves. I wonder, first of all, what you think of those reports. Does that pass the smell test to you?
Right.
And what do you think may have been going on in the minds of the Ukrainian leadership and the people in whether they wanted to obey the Minsk agreements?
So this is also now an area that has become a big bone of contention. And you mentioned how the historians will be wrestling with the role played by NATO expansion in triggering the war. I think they will also look at the Minsk Accords and whether that was also a missed opportunity. As best as I can make out, what happened is this: there was an attempt to provide some kind of special autonomous status for the two, quote, republics that the Russians had helped set up in 2014. That much we know. What we don't really know is what was the vision that Russia had versus what was the vision that Ukraine had. I think Ukraine wanted to have a sequence where it got control of the border, the republics were demilitarized, and then they would be given autonomy. The Russian sequencing was a bit different. So that's one
Mm,
point.
that's
The
fascinating.
second point is that Ukraine wanted to give the republics autonomy, but within the framework of a Ukrainian state that ultimately would have jurisdiction over those areas in an extensive manner. The Russians may have tried to create, in effect, a state within a state, with the republics possibly having a say on very important issues, including foreign policy. So I think the visions were very, very different. Now, was it a missed opportunity? Absolutely. I mean, had they been able to come to terms with that, we may not be. It's very hard to say. It's a counterfactual. We may not be where we are today. But this too is a question on which there's great disagreement. Whether the Ukrainians were obstreperous, whether Putin wanted too much, whether the West really did all it could to encourage the discussions. One other, if I might, missed opportunity was, you remember during the Maidan movement, right,
Yeah.
of 2014, there was actually an EU team that came to broker an agreement between the Yanukovych government and the opposition movement.
Hmm.
And Yanukovych, much to everybody's surprise, agreed to some extensive concessions. A change in the constitution where they'd go back to the previous constitution, where the president had much less power, moving elections forward.
Wait. Yanukovych. So you're talking here. Yanukovych was the guy who was elected, right?
Correct. He
Yeah.
was
So you're
elected
saying
in.
even before he stepped down, there was some addition or attempt to mediate what had caused the uprising that potentially could have kept him being driven out at all. That was actually in the
Absolutely.
cards. I'm actually not aware of that.
Yeah, one of the people who was negotiating was Radek Sikorski, the husband of Van Applebaum, who's now a very strong supporter of Ukraine. Radek Sikorski was, among other things, the foreign minister of Poland. And I believe he told the opposition, look, this is the best deal you're going to get. You should really come to terms with this. The problem is that by then, the Maidan had taken on a life of its own. Now, it's often called by some people in the West as a coup mounted by the West. I don't really buy that. I think it was a grassroots movement. But there's no question that once it began, the United States jumped in with both feet and made its position absolutely clear that it favored the Maidan movement. You will remember that Senator McCain, the late Senator McCain, was on
Right.
the the main square in Kiev,
Right. Yeah.
distributing cookies or whatnot, along with um, a senior official who then was intercepted talking on her cell phone to, this is Toria Newland,
Yeah.
to the American ambassador at the time in Kiev, Jeffrey Pyatt, discussing what the composition of the next Ukrainian government ought to be. So there's no question that we may. Now, the effect of that, I think, was to convince the Maidan protesters that, in a sense, we had their back and that they didn't need to strike a compromise. It may also have been
Yeah.
that the deal that was stitched together by the EU negotiating team could no longer be sold to the Maidan because they were thinking now not just about reforms, but getting rid of Yanukovych.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. So there's man, there's so many of these potential off ramps that could have happened. Now let's move into the next potential off ramp. Now, after the war has started in February, there is a move to, all right, let's find some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, I'll tell you as I recall it, and you tell me if I'm missing anything or if I'm mischaracterizing anything. But as I understand it, as we started moving through March, it was clear that Russia was not going to be able to just conquer all of Ukraine, certainly not to drive Zelensky out of Kiev. So I think Putin already realized that his maximalist gains were now impossible. It was also, though, clear that Ukraine didn't have the capacity, the force structure, or the manpower to drive Russia out all that. And it's like, okay, what can we do to bring this to a quick end? And so there began to be a number of mediation. One I believe was Prime Minister Naftali, I believe from Israel, and also Erdogan from Turkey. And in the late March, there was a meeting in Istanbul, 20th or 29th, I believe. And heading into that, Zelensky made a couple of comments that indicated that he was willing to take a position of neutrality in exchange for ending the war and a bunch of other things. But that was one of the key ones that appeared to be agreeable to both sides. And I remember distinctly that when that meeting was over that day, and I want to say it was March 29th, that both delegations exited saying nearly the same thing, that the general outlines of an agreement had been agreed to. And I was really optimistic because one of my biggest driving factors in talking about and writing about and going on TV about this war is that it needs to end as soon as possible to stop the egregious loss of life and the destruction of Ukrainian cities. And so I was really heartened by that. But less than 24 hours later, it's like everything went completely the opposite. Zelensky went into one far corner. Days later, Putin went into the other corner. And at least since then, there's been reports, and I can't speak to the veracity, that Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of the UK, actually said, "Hey, don't take that deal. We'll provide you with whatever we need to do, and just keep fighting." Now, whether that happened or whether that didn't, I don't know. What we do know for a fact is that both sides were hardened, and then things just escalated up from there. And I wonder if you can speak to any knowledge, or at least what the view on the ground was, just as far as among the Ukrainian people that what did they think about that possibility, and what has happened since?
Right. So this is yet another issue that will keep the historians busy for many years, and it remains a bone of contention now among those who've tried to provide explanations for why the war broke out. So there were two sets to try to stop the war. One was before the war, before Putin's troops actually crossed the border, and one was after. One set of negotiations was in Gomel in Belarus,
Mm,
and the second set was in Antalya in Turkey. And you mentioned the role of Naftali Bennett, who gave a fascinating interview that I know you've seen about his role in that negotiation, and on the Turkish side, Erdogan. Interestingly, Zelensky put NATO membership on the table, and in effect seemed to say, look, I'm not naive. We've been kept waiting for 14 years. We don't think we're going to get in. What is now facing us is the prospect possibly of some kind of war, maybe an all-out invasion. I'm prepared to put NATO expansion on the table. This we know. They were willing to do that. Bennett even said, as you will remember from his fascinating interview to Zelensky, look, you're not going to ever get into Ukraine. And by the way, NATO, by the way, Israel is not a member of NATO. We don't have a defense treaty with the United States. People often call Israel an American ally. In fact, it is
right.
not, as you know. There's no defense treaty between us and them. And he said, how do we take care of ourselves? Well, we've built up our own military strength, and
Yeah.
anyone who attacks us will have a terrific military to reckon with. You ought to do the same. What we don't know is why it fell apart. Here's my hunch. In order to
You're talking
forego,
right now, right before the invasion, right?
yes, right before, but also the talks right after, right? So why did those efforts collapse? Because had they worked, we wouldn't be in the middle of a
Right.
war that has wreaked havoc, and we can talk about that, I hope, later on.
Mhm.
What we don't know is why did the talks collapse? Now, there's the Boris Johnson theory, frankly, and I look upon him as a kind of clownish figure. And the idea that he went to Kiev and talked Zelensky out of this is not credible to me because the Ukrainians were single mindedly focused on what the Americans were telling them. And I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that we actually wanted a war to happen. Once the war began, we've thrown ourselves in on the Ukrainian side without equivocation. My guess is this, and again, I have to be careful, it's an informed guess, that in order to sell the idea of no NATO membership for Ukraine, that is Ukrainian neutrality, Zelensky had to come back with something big because remember by then there had been an amendment to the Ukrainian constitution and NATO membership was enshrined in the constitution.
Yep.
This was a thing that everybody after 2014 thought was a must have, except for maybe the fringes. My sense is that Zelensky wanted not only a resolution on the status of the two Russian supported republics in the Donbass, that is in the east, but he also wanted something very big on Crimea that Putin just was not prepared to give. My
Mhm.
point is not that Putin torpedoed the discussions, but they just didn't work out. I don't think anybody from the outside came in and said, "Don't do this. We have your back," because by then the Ukrainians were not clear exactly what were they going to receive. Right?
You
Bennett
know
said
what's
that,
also a factor in at least in the March 2022 incident, and this is fits into your category of only the historians will be able to tell us, but at least as far as Ukrainian public opinion seems to be, is that uh, almost simultaneous with this deal, that's when all the news started breaking about Bucha and about the
correct,
atrocities that happened there, and of course it galvanized the entire global attention, certainly in the West, especially that it just hardened the Ukrainian resolve, and it seemed to me, anyway, from the outside, to make any kind of negotiations in that moment virtually impossible. Because how could you make a deal with the devil? Someone evil who had done these things
correct,
in their mentality, and
correct.
that unfortunately, as someone who wasn't personally involved, it was so egregious to me and anguishing because the understandable anger that everyone in Ukraine would feel that would then say, well, let's keep fighting, of course, only results in an extension of the war and more people are dying. And now then they're, further away from an end to the war anyway since then. And potentially it could have, with sane heads on both sides, potentially that war could have ended at that point and the bloodshed could have stopped. And, now we have what we have and it doesn't matter what should have happened. It just, now we have where we are.
Correct. So a word about Bucha. You're, I believe, sitting in Washington, D.C. now. Think about Bethesda, Maryland. Bucha is kind of like Bethesda, Maryland is to Kiev. Think of it just a kind of as a suburb of Kiev. So I've been through there and talked to a number of people. And the reason I'm going into this is because there is this kind of lunacy theory that this was all staged by Ukrainian right-wing nationalists and it never happened. This is absolutely absurd. If you talk to people in Bucha, they tell you the same stories, more or less, unprompted. So the idea that Russian troops were heading toward Kiev and that Ukrainian nationalists said, oh, let's take this opportunity to kill a whole bunch of our people and create atrocities, just beggars belief. There's no question that Russian troops committed atrocities. That made it very difficult. So there's that. And then there's the question of what was each side asking for, and could they come to terms on a deal that they could both take home, Putin be satisfied with, and Zelensky be satisfied with, but also sell to the Ukrainian public. So we don't really know. What we do know is that it fell apart and we're in the middle of a war. And we can talk about that war and what it's done to
Yeah.
the country whenever you want to.
Yeah, since you talked about the fact that I believe you said you actually went to Bucha, right?
Yes.
Since the war started. Yeah, let's kind of shift gears on that a little bit and talk about your three trips to Ukraine. I wonder if you can kind of tell me uh, methodically and sequentially what was your observations there in terms of the mentality and the mindset of the people of Ukraine, and has it changed when the conditions of the war have changed around it?
The war has refashioned Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian identity. And let me explain to you this way. In my 2014 book, written with Eugene Rumer of the Carnegie Endowment, we painted a picture of Ukraine that was then quite common. That is, there were two Ukraines. There was one Ukraine in which ethnic Ukrainians predominated, center and the West largely. And there was another Ukraine that was seen as Russophone, that is, in the East and the South. There, a large proportion of the population, in some areas a majority, like Crimea, were either ethnic Russians who were Ukrainian citizens or Russians whose first, I'm sorry, Ukrainians whose first language was English. There was a kind of a divided Ukraine. There's something to this because if you look at the votes gotten by Yanukovych's party of the regions, that was seen as, quote, a pro Russian party, loosely speaking. Its strongholds were in the East and the South. So there's something to this, the question of what exactly was Ukrainian national identity, what was the place of Russians and Russian speakers within Ukraine. That's now gone by the wayside. I think there is a Ukrainian nationalism now in which ethnic Ukrainians and Russian speaking Ukrainians are all at one and see this as a war that they face against a Russian invader. Let me give you a case in point. Repeatedly, I have met Ukrainian soldiers, who spoke to me in Russian. And I thought, well, they're doing that because that's the language that they can communicate to me in, and they don't know English. But lo and behold, they began talking to each other in Russian. Turns out that these were Russian speakers, perhaps even ethnic Russians, who were fighting, whether in the east where I was or in the south, in Zaporizhia and in Kherson. And so the idea now that there are kind of two Ukraines has to be cast by the wayside. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the following. When the history books are written, we come back to the historians again. I think in an odd way, Putin will be seen as among the biggest contributors to the rise of a new civic nationalism in Ukraine, by which I mean a sense that within the borders of Ukraine, there are people of different linguistic and ethnic orientations, but they are one people. So, in a sense, the war has created an identity in the country and a unity in the country that I don't think is often appreciated by people who
So
are still
you're
stuck
talking about
on.
even on the Ukrainian control side, you're talking about the Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers on the Ukrainian side, right?
Correct, correct. Many of the soldiers I met were fluent Russian speakers, and incidentally,
Yeah,
Russian
Gary.
is
In fact,
spoken.
can you bring up some of those pictures that Raj has provided there from his time on the ground while he's talking here? Yeah, especially that one about the with the troops there. Just an
Yeah.
interesting image.
So this one, Danny, is Bucha. Large parts of it were destroyed, hasn't been rebuilt, and this was an apartment building that took a direct hit. This is me looking almost like a shrunken figure, but that's partly because the people on my left and right are gigantic individuals. This was taken a couple of miles from the front line of Bakhmut, and this is one example of two soldiers who spoke to me and my traveling companion in Russian, but then were speaking to each other in Russian all the time. But they were extraordinarily motivated in fighting Russians, and had there was no love lost between them and Vladimir Putin and the Russian soldiers. So this isn't what I mean. This is in Izium, not far from Kharkiv in the northeast, and it used to be an apartment building. Let me just say a word about this picture. This exemplifies what I saw over and over again. It is impossible to do justice by reportage in the New York Times or pictures taken by New York Times reporters or Washington Post reporters or Wall Street Journal reporters to the destruction that has been visited upon Ukraine. The estimate over a 10-year period is Ukrainian reconstruction could cost as much as $750 billion. 20% of the country is either internally displaced or is living abroad. So the whole question of what happens after the war is another story. So this is another example of the destruction you see. And you see this all over the place: hospitals, clinics, shopping centers, apartment buildings, waterworks. The whole country is just a scene of destruction, not in the West, which has largely been untouched, but certainly in the South and the East.
Gary, I'm sorry, Raj. I want to go back to what you were talking about at the beginning of this segment here, in terms of the type of people that are in Ukraine. So, it certainly in going back to the 2014 time frame when there was one Ukraine, and then now it was split along the current, or well, not now the line of contact, but what was the line of contact there. There appeared to be significant, growing hatred from those in the West against those who had rebelled, and in those who had rebelled against the West. Now they were all Ukrainians the day before all of this stuff happened, and so the question is, and this is maybe an unanswerable question, but something that should be addressed. There appears to be, not just a line on a map, but a line in the spirits between the two sides. And I wonder, when Zelensky keeps talking about he wants to recover all of Ukrainian territory, which of course would involve all of Luhansk and Donetsk in his best case scenario. Do those people even want to come back, and would they ever even contemplate it? Because there was essentially a civil war prior to this one breaking out, and would they even come back? How much is that mental and spiritual divide as much as it is on the map?
So there are two answers to this question. In the event that the Ukrainians were to be able to take all that territory back, and I think you and I have talked this to death, and we both agree although we disagree on certain aspects of the war, we're always having debates within defense priorities, as you know, that it's going to be a very big reach to take back all of the East, all of the South, including Crimea. But let's assume that wondrously that were to happen. The Ukrainian army would retake it, and it's not as if they would ask people, well, do you want to come back into Ukraine or not? The other way of looking at it is there are no parts of Ukraine that have been destroyed more than the so called pro Russian areas in the east and the south. Those are also the areas in which things like mass deportation of children and so on has occurred. So it's not clear to me that the Russian occupation has made people there well disposed toward Ukraine. Now, are there people there who might support the Russian occupation? There's no question about that. So I don't think reintegrating them will be a big problem. In any event, if the Ukrainian army will succeed, they will be reintegrated. The big challenge, Danny, is going to be making this country whole again, no matter what its borders ultimately turn out to be when the guns fall silent.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's something unfortunately we're probably not going to see for a while. And in fact, on the last section I want to discuss here, uh, what are we going to see going forward? And in particular, Ukraine has just attempted a pretty large scale counteroffensive starting in June, and at least as of today, it's pretty much petered out, and the line of contact hasn't changed too much, and it probably with the onset of winter, with the loss of the Ukrainian soldiers that they've had, with the now starting to be dwindling some of the supplies that they've gotten from the West militarily. It's pretty unlikely that line's going to change anytime soon, if ever. So the question is going to be going forward, at what point? Well, a couple of different possibilities here. Give me your thoughts on them. One, it suggests that militarily the line's just not going to move, and people are going to have to get used to dealing with an east-west kind of a situation. Some have called it the Korean scenario, where there's two separate republics going forward. The other one says that nope, Zelensky is just going to continue to fight if it takes forever. He'll never stop until he gets it back, and this could literally be years, and certainly would be a long time. I mean, I think the absolute best case scenario is that maybe next summer it's theoretically possible for Ukraine to have another offensive capacity that would have a chance to have more success than this one. But I would give that chance a very low probability of success. So militarily, probably this would just drift on for years, potentially, with the casualties continue to mount and no potential end coming in. That's one view. The second view says that because of all this loss and the Ukraine side seeing that, Russia's never going to quit either. And at some point you got to say, this is just no way to live. We'll never have any future. So we need to make some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, Zelensky has made a living from day one, literally day one, up until today, that there's no negotiations, there's no compromise until all the Russians are out, et cetera. And right now it looks like that the primary requirements of either side is in contra. It's not compatible with the other. So somebody is going to have to give, or else the death toll is just going to continue to rise. From the perspective of the Ukrainian people that that you've talked to, how do you see this playing out the rest of this year, or maybe even going beyond that?
Right. So these are all big, complicated questions, as you know, and you and I have talked about them at length. And it's one of them is at least a $64 million question. How does this end? But let me just provide some context, not for you so much as for your listeners who may have other things better to do in life than follow the war obsessively like you and I do. By September of last year, certainly by October, the Ukrainians had recovered about 50% of the land they lost after the war began. So that's the good news. The bad news is that if you look at this calendar year, although there have been some gains by this side and that side along a 700-mile front line that is shaped rather like a crescent, it begins in northern Kharkiv and then wends its way down towards southern Donbass and then ends up on the Ukrainian Black Sea coast. The net gain has been on Russia's side, but it amounts to about 600 miles or something like that, an area a little bigger than metropolitan Kiev. That is to say, the front lines haven't moved very much.
Yeah.
Will the counteroffensive succeed? Well, as you know, the Ukrainians are fighting on flat land in an area that the Russians have mined and built trenches in systematically, so-called Surovikin lines. The former commander of the Russian-Ukrainian operations who was later then relieved of his command by Putin because of his role in the Prigozhin affair.
Issue. Yeah.
It's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to make substantial progress given the artillery advantage and air power advantage. As you know, as a former warrior, you can't send armored columns through terrain like that without any air cover. So the question is, how much progress will there be made? The best chance they have is south of Robotine. They're pushing forward. They will, I think, within the next week, if my estimation is correct, probably take a village called Novoperkovka, which is about 20 miles from Tokmak, which is a major rail and road junction. Right? Even if they get that far, are we going to see by the end of the year something like a move toward the gates of Crimea or Ukraine reaching the Black Sea coast and cutting the Russian army in half? I would be very surprised to see it happen. Now, let's go back to the mood in Ukraine. So this is I think you and I can agree more or less the lay of the land militarily. I have yet to meet a single person in Ukraine, whether soldier or civilian, whether in the east, the north, the south, the center, who has said to me, the war, and upon my asking, that the war has induced so much suffering and so much destruction, and it's gone on for so long, and it looks like it will never end, that it is time to cut a deal with Putin. The war, the atrocities, the deportation of children, the loss of land, has created a hatred not just toward Putin, but I hasten to add toward Russians in general, that I think it's very hard for outsiders to fathom. It is
Mm.
deep. And what you're told over and over again is if Russia loses this war, they won't lose a country, they'll be humiliated. If we lose this war, we could lose our country. So the willingness to fight is very strong. There's something else. As much as we may see that Ukraine has an uphill battle, the belief there, partly because of the fulsome support of the West, but partly because of very strong morale and very good generalship, is that they can win the war. Now, we might stand back and say it is completely utopian to believe this, but that is the belief. But that is also Putin's belief. Right?
Yeah.
He thinks the war can be won and concluded on terms that he can take home and present as a victory. So, as you know, for a war to end, either one side has to completely defeat the other,
Yep.
or both sides have to say neither is going to win
Yeah.
and we have to have a deal. We're not at that point yet. So, where do we end up? And I think
Fortunately,
you
no.
would
Yeah.
agree with me. Come next year, we'll see this war continue. The biggest vulnerability for Ukraine, I don't think, is defeat by the Russian army. It is the fraying of Western support over time, which could happen. There are already some signs of this. You know what they
Yep.
are. I suspect your audience does too. Without Western support, they simply cannot continue. It's all well and good to say they'll keep fighting anyway, but Western support is a critical lifeline to them. And I think that they are disturbed about some of the things they're seeing in Congress. They're worried about trends in Germany. They're worried about trends in Slovakia, where Robert Fico has been elected, and he is a self-confessed
Yeah.
opponent of supporting Ukraine. And then there's Orban in Hungary and so on. So you could see this
And even in Poland,
coalition of 30
there's some
plus
new
states start
strains.
coming apart. And that would be a very serious problem for Ukraine.
Yeah, and all of that, Raj, just adds to my anguish because no matter for the moment, just take right and wrong off the table, to take off who's right, who's wrong, or who's strong, who's weak, whatever. The bottom line is that the bill payer keeps being the Ukrainian people in this fight on both sides of the line of contact,
Right.
because the Ukraine's on the right side of it, on the right hand side of it, are often victims of the shells from the Ukraine's on the left side of it. So it's not even for the Ukraine people, not even just Russia and Ukraine, but sometimes the Ukrainian people, even those you suggest on the Russian occupied section, may still desire to go back to Kiev. Even they're getting hit by shells coming from the Kiev government, and that's just anguishing to me to see. And I agree, unfortunately, with you. I don't see any prospect that either side is to that point you described yet. And certainly on the battlefield, nobody has an advantage today at any rate. So the war is virtually certain to keep going, and the death toll is virtually certain to keep rising. And that's a hard thing to watch from the outside. I can only imagine from somebody who's actually met many of them like you.
Correct. I don't know how much time we have left, but if I could just add a couple of
Sure.
words, right? Imagine that 20% of the American population were either internally displaced people or refugees. Well, that is the situation in Ukraine. So you have this huge population that has to be housed again, fed again, their kids have to go back to school, their hospitals have to be restored. That is a huge challenge. Then I'll talk about something that is near and dear to your heart, I'm sure. When the war ends and vets come back with PTSD, suicidal impulses, limbs missing, there's going to be a huge challenge to reintegrate them into society and make them whole again. I think I mentioned to you that for a time I worked on the New York City suicide hotline, and I talked to not a few of our soldiers who had come back from the front. Ukraine is going to have a huge problem with that. Then there's another question. Of the roughly 6 to 7 million refugees in Western Europe, how many of them will find new lives? How many will come back? What will that do to families? Will families be divided? There's a huge social problem, a whole set of social problems facing Ukraine beyond economic reconstruction, which will be, I'll venture a guesstimate. If you're a 50-year-old Ukrainian, you will not see your country made whole again under the best of circumstances during your lifetime. It is going to take a generation to do this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that you're right. That is one of the issues near and dear to my heart, because I see how many Americans suffer PTSD and traumatic brain injury during the both the Afghan and Iraq wars for 20 years in combined total. And in that one, we had, what was the number? Around 50,000, 55,000 total casualties, wounded and killed, with about 6,000 of those being killed. And look, that was like IEDs, roadside bombs, a few rockets, a few missiles here. But the scale of bombardment suffered by all of the participants of this war is off the charts. It's miles and miles, orders of magnitude greater than anything we faced during our
And
time
one of the
in this.
things we can't comprehend this, right? Because when is
Yeah,
the last time we had a war fought on American territory? I believe it's the War of 1812. Tell me if I'm wrong about this. So we haven't
right.
had a full-on foreign force occupy large parts of the country and destroy large parts of it. So this is a war really we can't comprehend. It's not Vietnam, it's not Afghanistan. It is a much bigger problem that has visited the heart of Ukrainian society. Now, the good news, morale is very high. The number of NGOs and civic organizations that have been formed to raise money for the troops, to get them essential supplies, to take care of those who've come back wounded or psychologically injured is enormous. So, in a sense, the war has united the country and created an effervescence of organizations that are working for it. But the tasks before these groups and before the government, even if the war ends on terms that Ukraine can say are satisfactory, is colossal.
Well, and Raj, that's another thing that I worry about. That's not even on the radar of anybody right now. Let's say that for whatever reason, by the end of the year, both sides do come to that point that you suggested, that both sides recognize I'm not going to be able to win militarily, so let's have a negotiated solution. And say by the end of January they come to one. Everybody shakes hands and they meet. Cameras are going on, and now then the West and the rest of the world turns their attention back to their own situation here. Now, all of those people that you talked about, they probably in the millions, I would argue, both military and civilian, who have struggled and suffered this, are going to need long-term care. But when the world's attention moves elsewhere, where's that money coming from? Where are the facilities coming from? The trained medical personnel, emotional support people, et cetera, stuff that we have a hard time paying in our country at the relatively small numbers that we have in comparison. It's going to be gargantuan in a country that's not even going to have a budget or an economy probably for many, many years to come. And I worry about what's going to happen with those people after the cameras start rolling from the West. And there's no answer for this, but it's coming, and it's going to be real. And the longer the war goes, the worse that post-war problem gets, I believe.
Here's my guess. When the war ends, we will say to the Europeans, we were critical in arming the Ukrainians. That's our strong suit. We did that. We also provided significant amounts of humanitarian aid. Altogether, the United States has provided something like $50 billion. Now the war's ended, and reconstruction, our European allies, is kind of in your lap. You have to handle this. Then there will be a discussion within the European Union about who gives how much for Ukraine. And then you will see differences occur. So there are lots of uncertainties remaining. If I had to write a book about this war down the road, I would call it the War of Surprises and the War of Uncertainties, because it was surprising that it happened. It was surprising how it's played out so far. Who thought the Russian army would still be fighting there? And then all of the uncertainties that you and I talked about. When will it end? What will Ukraine look like when it ends? What will be the peace terms? And so on.
Right. This is why I hate war. I've been there, I've seen it, I've fought in it, and I despise it worse than anybody. And why I belong to defense priorities, because we advocate a sane foreign policy that says let's don't just use war as the tool of first choice, like seems to be so many in our country want to do, because these are the real world consequences of that. And man, it's going to be extend so far beyond the end of this war. It's just horrible to even think about. But
Right.
I'm afraid we're gonna
Here's
have
the
to leave it
paradox.
there for the
Yeah, just a last word. Here's a
sure.
paradox about what you said, Danny. We know from history that wars are cruel, expensive, tragic, everything. But we never seem to learn the lessons, because war is something that the human race excels at. And so this is just yet another example.
Easy to get in war, easy to kill people, real hard to do the peace and the reconstruction afterwards. And I wish
Indeed
that we
so.
would keep that up front. Raj, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure, real treat to get some of your insights, and look forward to having you back on the show again in the future.
Thank you, Danny.
All right, we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis's Deep Dive. See you.